For generations, churches were places of humility, places where faith came before fortune, where giving was an act of love, not an investment. Tonight, we take a careful, documented look at 10 well-known pastors who have been repeatedly criticized by journalists, theologians, and former followers for promoting what is often called the prosperity gospel, a belief system where money becomes proof of righteousness and wealth is preached as a sign of divine favor. This is not an attack on Christianity. This is about power, money, and what happens when spiritual authority goes unchecked. In each chapter, we will examine one public figure, their rise, their message, their financial empires, and the controversies that followed. So before we begin, if you value thoughtful, well-researched documentaries like this, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin with the first name. Chapter 1. Kenneth Copeland. He did not begin as a symbol of controversy. Like many preachers of his generation, his early story was one of ambition, confidence, and belief that faith could change lives. Born in 1936, Copeland entered ministry during a time when televangelism was exploding across America. Television opened doors no church building ever could. A single sermon could now reach millions, and Copeland understood something crucial very early on. Media multiplied authority. His message was simple, memorable, and powerful, especially to struggling families. He taught that faith is a spiritual force, much like gravity. If applied correctly, it must produce results: health, success, and most importantly, wealth. This idea would later become known as prosperity theology, or, more bluntly, the prosperity gospel. At the heart of Copeland's preaching was a belief he repeated endlessly: God wants believers to be financially rich. Poverty, he suggested, was not holy. It was a sign of weak faith or spiritual failure. To many listeners, especially older Americans who had lived through economic hardship, this message felt hopeful. Finally, a faith that didn't ask you to endure suffering, but promised escape from it. Copeland often framed money as a spiritual test. If you sow generously, he preached, God is obligated to return it, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. Giving to his ministry was not portrayed as charity. It was described as an investment. And investments, Copeland assured his audience, always pay back, with interest. Over time, his ministry grew into a massive global operation. Television networks, publishing houses, conferences, and international outreach programs. But as the ministry expanded, so did scrutiny. Journalists began asking difficult questions. How much money was coming in? Where was it going? And why did a preacher who spoke against worldly attachments live in extraordinary luxury? Public records and investigations revealed that Copeland owned multiple private jets, including high-end aircraft typically reserved for corporate executives and heads of state. When questioned, Copeland did not deny this. Instead, he defended it. Commercial flights, he said, exposed him to demons. Private jets were not a luxury, they were a necessity for his spiritual mission. To critics, this explanation only deepened concerns. Former followers began speaking out. Some described intense pressure to give beyond their means. Others recalled being told that financial struggles were evidence of disobedience or lack of faith. The theology left little room for grace. If you were poor, it wasn't circumstance. It was failure. If you were sick, it wasn't biology. It was unbelief. And if the miracle never came, the system had an answer. You didn't give enough. You didn't believe hard enough. You didn't follow closely enough. The focus, critics argued, had quietly shifted. From scripture to self-enrichment. From service to status. From humility to power. Perhaps most troubling to theologians was how Copeland redefined God's role. In traditional Christianity, God is sovereign, unchangeable, and beyond manipulation. In Copeland's framework, however, God responds mechanically to human action. Say the right words, send the right donation, activate the blessing. Faith became transactional. This was not worship, it was a formula. Over the years, Copeland faced multiple investigations and intense media coverage, especially regarding tax exemptions, personal wealth, and financial transparency. Yet his influence never truly collapsed. Why? Because prosperity theology offers something emotionally powerful, especially to older believers. It promises control in an uncertain world. It tells you that chaos has rules, that suffering has shortcuts, that faith can function like a contract. And once someone has invested years of belief and money, walking away becomes painfully difficult. To admit doubt would mean admitting loss, so the system sustains itself. Followers give, leaders prosper, and criticism is framed as persecution. Kenneth Copeland remains active today, still preaching, still broadcasting, still surrounded by loyal supporters who view him not as a controversial figure, but as a misunderstood servant of God. But for many former believers, journalists, and scholars, his story stands as a warning, not about faith itself, but about what happens when religion adopts the language of business, when spiritual authority becomes immune to accountability, and when belief is measured not by compassion, but by cash flow. Kenneth Copeland was not the first to preach prosperity, and he would not be the last. In the next chapter, we examine another figure whose message followed a similar path, but whose controversies took a very different turn. Chapter 2. Creflo Dollar. His name alone tells a story, one that supporters say is symbolic and critics say is revealing. Born in 1962, Dollar rose to prominence during the peak years of American megachurch expansion, when ministries were no longer confined to local congregations but operated as global brands. He founded World Changers Church International, a church that would grow into one of the most influential prosperity-focused ministries in the world. At the center of Dollar's message was a simple but controversial claim: God wants you to be rich. Not comfortable, not secure, rich. Dollar taught that poverty was not noble, not spiritual, and not part of God's design. Instead, he framed financial struggle as a spiritual condition, one that could be corrected through obedience, faith, and most importantly, giving. In his sermons, money was rarely treated as a neutral tool. It was a spiritual signal. Giving was not optional generosity, it was obedience. And obedience, Dollar preached, triggered divine return. He often emphasized seed faith, the idea that donations given to the church, especially sacrificial ones, would multiply back into the giver's life. But this multiplication, followers were told, only worked when the seed was sown into the right soil. That soil, of course, was the ministry. Over time, Dollar's sermons became increasingly explicit about finances. Tithing was not just encouraged, it was expected. Questioning the system was framed as doubt. Doubt, in turn, was framed as rebellion. This dynamic created a powerful psychological loop. If you gave and prospered, the message worked. If you gave and struggled, the fault was yours. Never the doctrine, never the leadership. The controversy surrounding Dollar reached its peak in 2015, when his ministry launched a public fundraising campaign to purchase a $65 million Gulfstream G650 private jet. The justification was framed in spiritual terms. The jet was necessary for ministry efficiency. Commercial flights limited God's work. The world was too dangerous and inconvenient for a man of divine purpose. Public backlash was immediate. Even many Christians who tolerated prosperity theology drew a line. A private jet costing tens of millions, funded by donations from everyday believers, felt excessive. The campaign was eventually withdrawn after widespread criticism, but the damage was done. For journalists, the jet symbolized what they had long suspected, that the ministry functioned less like a church and more like a corporation, one where success flowed upward. Former members later described environments where financial pressure was constant. Sermons emphasized giving milestones. Testimonies focused on monetary gain. Faith was measured in outcomes. Dollar defended his teachings by reframing Scripture. He argued that Jesus himself rejected poverty, that suffering was not virtuous, that abundance was proof of covenant. The problem, theologians responded, was not wealth itself, but how it was spiritualized. Traditional Christianity teaches that faith does not guarantee comfort. It teaches humility, service, and sacrifice. Dollar's version inverted this. Success became evidence of righteousness. Failure became evidence of error. And once faith is judged by finances, the system becomes unforgiving. Those who fall behind are not supported, they are blamed. Critics also questioned the lack of financial transparency common to many megachurch ministries. As a tax-exempt religious organization, Dollar's ministry was not required to disclose detailed spending reports. This secrecy, combined with lavish personal lifestyles, fueled ongoing suspicion. Yet, like many prosperity preachers, Dollar's influence did not collapse. Why? Because his message aligned perfectly with modern aspiration. It spoke to people who worked hard, struggled quietly, and wanted reassurance that God was on their side financially. It promised dignity through wealth, control through giving, meaning through success. And once belief is tied to identity, especially later in life, walking away feels like betrayal, not just of a church, but of oneself. In recent years, Dollar has attempted to soften some of his most extreme positions. He has acknowledged past errors regarding tithing doctrine and admitted that some teachings were overstated. But for many critics, the core structure remains unchanged. The system still rewards loyalty with promises, still links faith to finances, still places leadership beyond accountability. Creflo Dollar's story is not just about money. It is about what happens when spiritual authority defines the terms of blessing, when obedience replaces discernment, and when faith is no longer a refuge, but a transaction. He stands as a reminder that not every message spoken from a pulpit is meant to heal. Some are designed to extract. In the next chapter, we examine a pastor whose influence reached far beyond church walls, through television screens, miracle claims, and mass healing crusades. A figure whose promises were dramatic, and whose controversies were impossible to ignore. Chapter 3. Benny Hinn. Few religious figures of the modern era have been as visually unforgettable as Benny Hinn. For decades, his image was broadcast into millions of homes around the world. A man in a white suit, holding a microphone, standing before enormous crowds, promising healing, restoration, and divine intervention, right now. Benny Hinn built his ministry on spectacle. Unlike some prosperity preachers who focused primarily on money and success, Hinn centered his message on miracles. Cancer healed, pain erased, blind eyes opened. But woven tightly into those promises was a familiar condition: faith expressed through obedience, and obedience expressed through giving. Born in 1952, Hinn rose to prominence in the late 1980s and 1990s, a golden age of televangelism. Television networks allowed religious leaders to bypass traditional church structures and speak directly to viewers, often vulnerable ones. Hinn understood television better than most. His crusades were carefully staged. Music swelled at key moments. Testimonies were emotionally charged. The atmosphere felt electric, urgent, supernatural. Viewers were encouraged to believe that miracles were not distant or symbolic, but immediate and physical. And many did believe. Donations poured in from across the globe. Supporters were told that giving to the ministry aligned them with God's healing power. Sowing financially into Hinn's work was framed as an act of faith, sometimes even a prerequisite for breakthrough. Critics would later argue that this blurred a dangerous line. If healing required faith, and faith required giving, then failure to heal implied spiritual deficiency or insufficient generosity. Journalists began investigating the outcomes. Where were the documented healings? What happened to those who claimed miracles after the cameras stopped rolling? Several investigative reports followed individuals who had appeared on stage claiming healing, only to later admit their conditions remained unchanged. Medical documentation rarely supported the dramatic claims. Meanwhile, Hinn's personal lifestyle came under scrutiny. Reports revealed luxury homes, expensive clothing, high-end travel, and significant financial reserves, all funded by donations from believers seeking divine intervention. In the eyes of critics, the contrast was stark. Followers prayed for relief from illness and debt. The preacher lived in extraordinary comfort. Former insiders later described an environment where questioning was discouraged. Doubt was framed as spiritual weakness. Criticism was labeled persecution. Those who left the ministry often spoke of emotional devastation, not just financial loss. They had believed not only in a man, but in a promise. And when that promise failed, the disappointment cut deeply. Theological scholars also raised alarms. Christian doctrine traditionally teaches that healing is not guaranteed, and that suffering is not evidence of failure. Hinn's ministry, however, often implied the opposite. If you were healed, God favored you. If you weren't, something was wrong with you. This belief system placed enormous psychological pressure on the sick and the elderly, many of whom donated beyond their means, hoping for relief. By the early 2000s, public criticism intensified. Governments and watchdog groups examined the financial transparency of healing ministries. Hinn's organization faced repeated questions about accountability and spending. Then, in a surprising turn, Hinn himself began to distance publicly from some prosperity teachings. In later interviews, he admitted that certain fundraising practices were wrong. He acknowledged that the constant emphasis on money had damaged credibility. But critics argued that these admissions came after decades of accumulation. The systems remained. The wealth remained. The harm, they said, could not be undone with words alone. Yet Benny Hinn's influence never fully disappeared. Why? Because miracle-based ministries tap into something profoundly human, especially among older believers: hope. When medicine fails, when pain persists, when life feels unfair, the promise of divine intervention feels irresistible. And when that promise is delivered with confidence, authority, and emotional power, it can override skepticism. Hinn did not invent this dynamic, but he mastered it. His story reveals how faith combined with spectacle can silence critical thinking, how desperation can be redirected into devotion, and how spiritual authority can become financially untouchable. For many former followers, the greatest injury was not financial. It was spiritual. They were left asking whether their faith had been exploited, whether their suffering had been used, and whether the miracle they were promised was ever meant to arrive. Benny Hinn's ministry stands as a cautionary tale, not about belief itself, but about who controls belief, and what happens when healing becomes a business model. In the next chapter, we turn to a pastor who avoided miracle theatrics altogether, one whose message was softer, calmer, and more palatable, yet whose influence would become even larger. A preacher of positivity, success, and smiles. Chapter 4. Joel Osteen. He does not shout. He does not threaten hellfire. He does not demand obedience in harsh terms. He rarely even uses the word sin. And that is precisely why his influence has been so vast. For millions of viewers, especially older audiences seeking comfort rather than confrontation, Joel Osteen represents a gentler face of modern Christianity. A pastor who smiles, encourages, and reassures. A man who promises that tomorrow can be better than today. But beneath the optimism lies a message that critics argue is just as closely tied to prosperity theology as the more aggressive preachers, only delivered with a softer touch. Joel Osteen rose to prominence after taking over leadership of Lakewood Church, one of the largest megachurches in the United States. Under his guidance, the church moved into a former professional sports arena, symbolizing a shift not just in size, but in style. This was no longer a traditional church. It was an experience. Sermons were broadcast worldwide. Books topped bestseller lists. Television appearances multiplied. Osteen's core message centered on a single idea. God wants you to live your best life now. Not later, not in eternity, now. To many listeners, this message felt refreshing. Faith without fear, religion without guilt, hope without hardship. But theologians began raising concerns. In Osteen's sermons, suffering is rarely addressed as meaningful or transformative. Poverty is not explored as a social reality. Sacrifice is not emphasized. Instead, the focus remains on personal success, inner positivity, and outward blessing. Critics argue that this framing subtly reinforces prosperity thinking, even when money is not explicitly mentioned. If life is not improving, if success does not arrive, if joy feels distant, the implication is quiet but clear. Something is wrong with you. Perhaps your mindset, perhaps your faith, perhaps your attitude. This approach places responsibility entirely on the individual, while leaving structural issues, injustice, and hardship unaddressed. Financial controversy followed as Lakewood Church expanded. While Osteen does not publicly emphasize tithing as aggressively as other prosperity pastors, the ministry operates with immense wealth. The church's assets, production quality, and global reach require enormous funding. Osteen himself became one of the wealthiest pastors in the world, largely through book sales and speaking engagements tied directly to his ministry platform. When questioned about wealth, Osteen consistently responds that he does not take a salary from the church. To supporters, this proves integrity. To critics, it sidesteps the larger question. Would the books have sold without the church platform? Would the influence exist without the pulpit? The line between ministry and personal brand, critics argue, is almost invisible. One of the most significant moments of public backlash came during times of crisis, when critics questioned Lakewood Church's response to local disasters. Although explanations were later offered, the initial perception that a massive, wealthy church appeared slow to open its doors damaged public trust. For many observers, the moment symbolized a deeper issue. A faith built on positivity struggles to respond when reality turns dark. Osteen's sermons rarely confront moral complexity. They avoid difficult doctrines. They favor affirmation over accountability. For older believers, this can feel comforting, but also incomplete. Theological critics argue that Christianity stripped of sacrifice becomes self-help with Scripture attached. God becomes a motivator. Faith becomes a mindset. Worship becomes affirmation. And money, while not openly demanded, becomes the quiet proof that the system works. Those who succeed feel validated. Those who struggle feel invisible. Former members have described feeling emotionally uplifted but spiritually shallow. Inspired but unsupported when life grew hard. Yet Joel Osteen remains enormously popular. Why? Because his message aligns perfectly with modern culture. It avoids conflict. It avoids guilt. It avoids discomfort. And for many people, especially later in life, comfort feels like truth. But critics argue that comfort without depth can be dangerous. When faith never prepares you for loss, when sermons never address injustice, when belief is measured by happiness alone, then religion risks becoming a mirror, not a guide. Joel Osteen may not preach prosperity as loudly as others. He may not demand jets or miracle money. But his ministry, critics say, reflects a polished, sanitized version of the same promise. Believe correctly, think positively, and good things will come. And if they don't, the silence speaks volumes. In the next chapter, we turn to a preacher whose rise and fall was far more dramatic. A man whose empire collapsed publicly, and whose story became one of the most infamous scandals in modern religious history. Chapter 5. Jim Bakker. Bakker's was not subtle. It was explosive. In the late 1970s and 1980s, Bakker became one of the most recognizable faces in American religious television. Alongside his wife, he co-founded the PTL Club, a Christian broadcasting network that blended faith, entertainment, and fundraising into a format that felt modern, exciting, and optimistic. For many viewers, especially older Americans, the show felt friendly and reassuring. It looked less like church and more like family television. Smiling hosts, uplifting stories, promises of blessing. But behind the cheerful facade, a different system was taking shape, one where faith and finance became inseparable. Bakker's message aligned closely with prosperity theology. God wanted believers to prosper. Giving to the ministry was a way to unlock divine favor. Financial success was framed as proof of spiritual alignment. And viewers responded. Donations poured in by the millions. What made Bakker's empire unique was its scale. The ministry expanded beyond television into real estate, theme parks, hotels, and vacation resorts. The crown jewel was Heritage USA, a Christian-themed resort marketed as a wholesome alternative to secular entertainment. Supporters were encouraged to purchase lifetime partnerships, often costing thousands of dollars, with promises of spiritual benefits and future accommodations. For retirees and older believers, these partnerships felt meaningful, both as an investment in faith and a symbol of belonging. But the promises quietly exceeded reality. As journalists later uncovered, the number of partnerships sold vastly outnumbered the resort's actual capacity. Thousands of people paid for benefits that could never realistically be delivered. Meanwhile, Bakker and his inner circle lived extravagantly. Luxury homes, expensive cars, lavish lifestyles funded by donations from viewers, many of whom were living on fixed incomes. The gap between message and reality widened. Then came the scandal. Investigations revealed not only financial misconduct, but also moral failures within the leadership. Bakker was accused of fraud and deception, and in 1989, he was convicted on multiple counts related to misusing ministry funds. The fall was swift and public. Television networks cut ties. Supporters felt betrayed. The ministry collapsed almost overnight. For many believers, the damage went far beyond money. They had trusted a spiritual authority. They had given in good faith. And now they were forced to confront a painful question. Had their belief been manipulated? Bakker was sentenced to prison, becoming one of the most high-profile religious figures ever incarcerated for financial crimes. His convictions sent shockwaves through the Christian community and sparked national debates about televangelism, accountability, and religious fundraising. Some argued that Bakkar was an exception, a cautionary tale of excess. Others argued he was simply the first to be exposed. After serving time, Jim Bakkar eventually returned to ministry, but the message had changed. Gone was the cheerful entertainment. In its place came fear-based preaching centered on end-times prophecy, survivalism, and selling emergency supplies. Food buckets, survival gear, apocalyptic warnings. Once again, donations were tied to promises, this time not of prosperity, but of protection. Critics argued that the pattern was the same. Fear replaced hope, urgency replaced joy. But money remained central. Older audiences were again targeted, particularly those anxious about global instability, health crises, and uncertainty. The system adapted, but it did not disappear. Theological scholars often point to Bakkar's story as a clear example of what happens when religious authority operates without oversight. No transparency, no accountability, no checks on power. Faith became a shield. Criticism became persecution. And followers were conditioned to trust the message over the evidence. Jim Bakkar's rise and fall is perhaps the most dramatic example in this series, but it is not unique. His story reveals how easily sincere belief can be transformed into a financial engine, how charisma can override caution, and how spiritual language can be used to justify almost anything. For many former supporters, the collapse left lasting scars, not just financially, but spiritually. Some walked away from organized religion entirely. Others struggled to trust any spiritual leader again. The greatest tragedy, critics argue, was not Bakkar's personal downfall, but the erosion of faith it caused in millions of quiet believers who had done nothing wrong. Jim Bakkar did not invent prosperity theology, but his story showed the world what it looks like when that theology is pushed to its extreme. An empire built on belief collapsed under scrutiny. In the next chapter, we examine a pastor whose influence operated more quietly, one who avoided scandal for years. Chapter 6. Paula White. She Rise did not follow the traditional path of American pastors. She did not inherit a pulpit. She did not emerge from a large theological institution. Instead, she built her influence through charisma, proximity to power, and relentless messaging about obedience and blessing. For many supporters, especially older believers seeking certainty in a confusing world, Paula White presented herself as a spiritual guide who spoke with confidence, clarity, and authority. Her message was direct. God rewards alignment. Alignment with faith. Alignment with leadership. Alignment with divine order. And alignment, she taught, was proven through loyalty and giving. White's ministry leaned heavily on prosperity theology, but with a distinct emphasis on spiritual hierarchy. She preached that certain leaders were anointed and that blessings flowed downward through obedience to those God had chosen. Questioning leadership was not framed as discernment, it was framed as rebellion. In sermons and conferences, White often spoke about spiritual doors opening and closing, doors that could determine financial success, health, and destiny itself. Giving to the ministry was described as a way to remain on the right side of those doors. To critics, this created a deeply troubling dynamic. Faith became conditional, blessing became selective, and spiritual fear became a tool of compliance. Former members later described feeling intense pressure to give, sometimes during emotionally charged services where attendees were told that hesitation could block God's favor. Older believers, many living on fixed incomes, were encouraged to trust God completely with their finances. The message was subtle but persistent. If you hold back, you hold yourself back. White's rise accelerated as she gained access to powerful platforms. Media appearances, conferences, and political connections expanded her reach far beyond a single congregation. To supporters, this visibility confirmed divine favor. To critics, it raised questions. Why did so much authority rest in one individual? Why was accountability rarely discussed? Why did financial transparency remain limited? Journalists examining White's ministry noted repeated patterns common to prosperity-focused organizations: high-pressure fundraising, emotional appeals, and limited public disclosure of spending. Yet criticism was often dismissed as spiritual attack. Those who questioned were accused of jealousy, bitterness, or lacking faith. This framing served an important purpose. It isolated believers from outside voices. It strengthened internal loyalty, and it ensured that leadership remained unquestioned. Theologically, scholars expressed concern over White's interpretation of Scripture. Traditional Christianity emphasizes humility, shared leadership, and service to the vulnerable. White's teachings, critics argued, inverted this structure. Leadership became elevated, followers became instruments, and God's will became indistinguishable from institutional success. Another area of controversy involved how White linked obedience to personal outcomes. Illness, financial struggle, or failure were often framed as evidence of spiritual misalignment, rather than circumstance or hardship. For older believers facing health issues or economic insecurity, this message carried heavy emotional weight. If you suffer, you are failing. If you fail, you are disobedient. This belief system left little room for grace. Despite mounting criticism, White's influence persisted. Why? Because her message offered certainty. In an unstable world, certainty is comforting. In later life, clarity feels safer than complexity. White spoke with confidence where others hesitated. She offered answers where life offered ambiguity. And for many, that was enough. But former followers who eventually left described a different experience. They spoke of burnout, of guilt, of financial strain, of fear that questioning would lead to spiritual consequences. Leaving the ministry often meant losing community, identity, and perceived protection. This is the hidden cost critics point to: not just money lost, but trust eroded. Paula White's story highlights a critical danger within prosperity-driven systems, when spiritual authority becomes centralized and obedience replaces conscience. Faith becomes less about relationship and more about compliance. For theologians, White's ministry represents a warning about how easily spiritual language can be used to justify power structures, especially when wrapped in encouragement and positivity. She did not preach fear openly. She preached favor. But favor, when controlled by authority, becomes leverage. Paula White remains a polarizing figure, admired by supporters, criticized by scholars, and questioned by journalists. Her story is not about one person alone. It is about what happens when belief, money, and authority intertwine, when loyalty is rewarded and doubt is punished, and when spiritual guidance becomes a one-way command. In the next chapter, we examine a pastor whose story took a darker turn, one marked by immense influence, secrecy, and allegations that shook an entire congregation. Chapter 7. Eddie Long. For many years, Bishop Eddie Long was seen as untouchable. He was powerful, he was wealthy, and to thousands of followers, he was God's chosen authority. As the leader of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Georgia, Eddie Long presided over one of the most influential congregations in the country. His sermons were forceful, emotional, and commanding. He spoke with certainty, never hesitation. To older believers, especially those raised to respect church hierarchy, Long represented something familiar and reassuring: strong leadership. A man who knew God's will and was unafraid to declare it. But beneath the surface, critics argue, the ministry reflected many of the same patterns seen in prosperity-driven churches across America. Long preached obedience. He emphasized submission to spiritual authority, and he linked faithfulness to material blessing. Wealth was not treated as suspicious, it was celebrated. Long himself lived lavishly. Luxury homes, expensive cars, designer clothing. To supporters, this prosperity was proof of God's favor. To critics, it was a red flag. Journalists began questioning how a pastor could afford such a lifestyle while leading a tax-exempt religious organization supported by donations from everyday believers. As with many megachurches, financial transparency was limited. Members were encouraged to give generously, but were rarely shown how funds were allocated. Giving was framed not as optional generosity, but as spiritual responsibility. In sermons, Long often emphasized the concept of covering. To be under spiritual covering meant protection, blessing, and alignment with God. To step outside that covering meant exposure to failure, hardship, and judgment. This teaching created a powerful psychological structure. If you questioned leadership, you risked losing divine protection. If you doubted, you endangered your future. For older members, many of whom valued stability and community, this belief reinforced silence. Then, in 2010, everything changed. Eddie Long became the subject of multiple lawsuits alleging sexual misconduct involving young men connected to the church. The allegations sent shockwaves through the congregation and beyond. Long denied the accusations, framing them as attacks against a man of God. Supporters rallied, viewing the situation as persecution. Critics, however, saw familiar patterns. A powerful leader, a loyal inner circle, an institution trained to distrust outsiders. The lawsuits were eventually settled out of court, leaving many questions unanswered. But the damage to trust, credibility, and faith was irreversible. For many former members, the most painful part was not the allegations themselves, but the response. Questions were discouraged, doubters were marginalized, silence was treated as loyalty. The prosperity framework that had once promised protection now functioned as a shield for leadership. Theological scholars pointed out a troubling contradiction. Long had publicly preached strict moral standards, particularly regarding sexuality, while allegedly violating those same standards privately. This hypocrisy, critics argued, revealed a deeper issue: unchecked authority. When leaders are elevated beyond accountability, faith becomes fragile. For older believers who had trusted Long for decades, the fallout was devastating. Some lost their church family. Some lost their sense of spiritual safety. Some lost trust in organized religion altogether. Yet even after the scandal, Long retained significant influence until his death in 2017. Why? Because prosperity systems do not collapse easily. They are built on loyalty. They frame criticism as attack, and they teach followers that walking away is more dangerous than staying. Eddie Long's story illustrates how prosperity theology often intersects with control. Money is not the only currency. Fear is equally valuable. Fear of losing blessing, fear of losing protection, fear of being cast out. When faith becomes entangled with fear, silence becomes survival. Long's ministry did not fall because of theology alone. It fell because secrecy finally collided with exposure. And when that happens, belief systems built on authority rather than humility cannot withstand scrutiny. For critics, Eddie Long represents a sobering lesson. When churches resemble kingdoms, when leaders resemble kings, and when questioning is treated as betrayal, faith becomes vulnerable to exploitation. His legacy is a reminder that power without accountability corrodes, that prosperity preached from the pulpit can mask deep dysfunction, and that spiritual authority must never be immune to examination. In the next chapter, we examine a pastor whose influence extends far beyond one country, a figure accused of building not just a church, but a system of absolute control. Chapter 8. Apollo Quiboloy. His influence did not grow quietly. It expanded with confidence, certainty, and an unmistakable claim to absolute spiritual authority. One that went far beyond prosperity preaching and into something far more extreme. Quiboloy, founder of the Kingdom of Jesus Christ movement based in the Philippines, did not present himself merely as a pastor. He claimed a singular role in divine history, teaching followers that he was uniquely chosen, appointed, and spiritually elevated above all others. For supporters, this claim explained his power. For critics, it explained the danger. At the center of Quiboloy's doctrine was obedience. Not symbolic obedience, not personal devotion, but total submission. He taught that spiritual blessing flowed directly through him, that alignment with his authority determined one's fate, spiritually, financially, and eternally. In this system, prosperity was not just promised, it was conditional. Those who followed faithfully would be protected, elevated, and blessed. Those who questioned risked punishment, not just socially, but spiritually. Money played a crucial role. Followers were encouraged, often pressured, to give generously to the organization. Donations funded massive properties, private compounds, media networks, and luxurious lifestyles for leadership. Public records and investigative reporting raised serious questions about how these funds were used. Journalists documented lavish estates, private aircraft, and high-security residences, while ordinary followers lived modestly, many in service to the organization. Former members later described a system where financial giving was tied to loyalty. The more you gave, the more trusted you became. The more trusted you became, the closer you were allowed to leadership. For older believers, especially those raised in cultures that emphasized respect for authority and hierarchy, this structure felt familiar, even righteous. Questioning leadership was portrayed as rebellion against God himself. And rebellion, Quiboloy taught, carried consequences. As the movement expanded, so did allegations. International law enforcement agencies and investigative journalists accused Quiboloy of severe misconduct, including exploitation and abuse of followers. He denied all allegations, framing them as persecution orchestrated by enemies threatened by divine truth. Supporters rallied behind him, repeating a familiar refrain: "A man of God is under attack." This narrative is common in prosperity-driven systems. Criticism is not evidence, it is opposition. Accountability is not justice, it is persecution. And loyalty is framed as righteousness. Former members who spoke out described intense psychological control, isolation from family, fear of spiritual punishment, loss of identity outside the group. Leaving was not simply walking away from a church, it meant losing community, purpose, and perceived salvation. The financial consequences were often severe. Some former followers reported giving their life savings, properties, or retirement funds to the organization, believing that obedience would guarantee protection and blessing. For older individuals, this loss was irreversible. Theologically, scholars describe Quiboloy's system as authoritarian religion, a structure where one individual becomes the final interpreter of truth, morality, and destiny. In such systems, prosperity theology becomes a tool of enforcement. Blessing rewards loyalty. Hardship punishes doubt. And since life is unpredictable, any outcome can be explained. Success proves faith. Suffering proves disobedience. The leader is never wrong. As global attention intensified, Quiboloy's influence faced mounting pressure. Legal cases multiplied. International scrutiny increased. Yet his core following remained remarkably loyal. Why? Because when belief is total, doubt becomes terrifying. To question the leader would mean questioning years of sacrifice, money given, relationships lost, and identity reshaped. For many, it was easier to believe the accusations were lies than to accept that their faith had been weaponized. Apollo Quiboloy's story represents the most extreme edge of prosperity-driven religion. Here, money is not just a sign of blessing, it is proof of obedience. Authority is not symbolic, it is absolute. And faith is not personal, it is controlled. Critics argue that this is where unchecked spiritual power inevitably leads, not merely to wealth, but to domination. For older believers watching from a distance, Quiboloy's case offers a sobering lesson. When one voice claims divine immunity, when leadership rejects accountability, and when faith demands silence, religion ceases to be spiritual. It becomes political, psychological, and deeply dangerous. In the next chapter, we turn to a pastor whose influence is quieter, more polished, and far more subtle. A teacher whose message centers on grace and abundance, yet whose critics argue prosperity remains the unspoken foundation. Chapter 9. Joseph Prince. He does not fit the stereotype many people associate with prosperity preachers. He does not shout. He does not demand money aggressively. He does not threaten punishment from the pulpit. Instead, he smiles calmly, speaks gently, and centers his sermons around one word above all others: grace. For millions of followers around the world, particularly older believers who are weary of fear-based religion, Joseph Prince appears to offer a refreshing alternative. A message without condemnation. A faith without constant guilt. A God who blesses freely. But critics argue that beneath this comforting surface lies a refined, modern form of prosperity theology. One that avoids overt fundraising pressure, yet still links faithfulness to material and physical outcomes. Joseph Prince is the senior pastor of New Creation Church in Singapore, one of the largest and wealthiest churches in Asia. His sermons are broadcast internationally, his books sell in massive numbers, and his influence extends far beyond his local congregation. At the center of his teaching is what he calls hyper-grace. The core idea is simple. Believers are fully forgiven. God no longer sees sin. Grace, not effort, unlocks blessing. To many listeners, especially those raised in strict religious environments, this message feels liberating. No more fear. No more shame. No more striving. But theologians and former followers have raised important concerns. While Prince emphasizes grace, his sermons often include repeated assurances that believers who truly understand grace will experience victory in life. Victory over sickness, failure, anxiety, and lack. Over time, this creates a subtle expectation. If grace is fully understood, then negative outcomes should decrease. Health should improve. Success should increase. Life should get better. And when it doesn't? The problem is rarely framed as mystery or hardship. It is framed as misunderstanding. You didn't fully grasp grace. You didn't receive the revelation deeply enough. This mirrors a core mechanism of prosperity theology, only in softer language. Blessing becomes evidence of correct belief. Struggle becomes evidence of incomplete understanding. Joseph Prince has often taught that physical healing is part of Christ's work, and that believers should expect wholeness in their bodies. While this is not unique to him, critics argue that repeated emphasis on healing can create silent pressure, especially for older believers dealing with chronic illness. If healing does not come, the believer may internalize blame. Not enough faith. Not enough revelation. not enough grace received. Financial themes also appear frequently, though rarely framed as direct promises of wealth. Prince often speaks of abundance, favor, and increase. He emphasizes that God delights in blessing his children, not only spiritually, but practically. While he avoids explicit give to get language, critics argue that the underlying message remains consistent. Right belief leads to better outcomes. This belief system aligns closely with prosperity thinking, even if it avoids its harsher expressions. As New Creation Church grew, so did questions about wealth. The church operates large-scale facilities, high-end media production, and international outreach. Joseph Prince himself has become extremely wealthy through book sales and global speaking, activities inseparable from his role as a pastor. Supporters argue that this wealth proves the message works. Critics argue that it proves the system rewards leadership disproportionately. Once again, transparency becomes an issue. Like many megachurches, New Creation Church is not required to disclose detailed financial statements publicly. Members are encouraged to give, but rarely see full breakdowns of spending. Faith is expected. Trust is assumed. For older believers, many of whom grew up respecting institutions and authority, this structure feels normal. But former members describe a different experience. Some report feeling pressured to maintain a positive confession at all times. Negative emotions were discouraged. Doubt was quietly sidelined. Suffering was not explored. It was bypassed. This created an emotional paradox. People were surrounded by messages of victory, while privately struggling with loss, illness, or financial stress. And because the theology emphasized success as a natural result of grace, failure felt isolating. Joseph Prince has responded to criticism by insisting that he does not preach prosperity, but grace. And in a narrow sense, that is true. He does not demand donations. He does not promise mansions. He does not threaten curses. But critics argue that prosperity does not require promises, only implication. When sermons consistently highlight success stories, when healing is emphasized more than endurance, when abundance is celebrated more than sacrifice, a quiet hierarchy forms. Those who prosper feel validated. Those who suffer feel invisible. Theological scholars caution that Christianity, historically, has never promised ease. It acknowledges suffering, injustice, and mystery. It teaches perseverance, not constant victory. When these elements are minimized, faith risks becoming conditional. Good outcomes mean belief is correct. Bad outcomes mean belief is flawed. Joseph Prince's ministry represents a 21st century evolution of prosperity theology, one designed for educated, media-savvy, global audiences. It replaces pressure with positivity, threats with reassurance, demands with encouragement. But the structure remains intact. Blessing is expected. Success is normalized, and hardship becomes an anomaly to be explained away. For older viewers, this message can be deeply appealing. It offers comfort without confrontation, hope without heaviness, faith without fear. But critics urge caution, because when faith no longer prepares people for suffering, when sermons no longer address injustice or loss, and when belief is measured by outcomes rather than integrity, religion becomes fragile. Joseph Prince is not accused of scandal on the scale of others in this series. There are no dramatic collapses, no criminal convictions. And that, critics argue, is precisely why his influence is so significant. Because prosperity theology does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives softly, wrapped in grace, speaking gently, promising peace. And for many believers, it feels indistinguishable from truth. In the next chapter, we examine a pastor whose story returns us to America, a figure whose rise, exposure, and persistence reveal how prosperity messages can survive even after public disgrace. Chapter 10. Peter Popoff. If most religious scandals follow a simple arc, rise, exposure, collapse, then Peter Popoff's story breaks the pattern completely. Because in his case, exposure did not end the ministry, it merely transformed it. And that fact alone makes Peter Popoff one of the most important figures in understanding how prosperity-based religion survives, even when deception is proven beyond doubt. Peter Popoff rose during a moment when America was uniquely vulnerable. The late 1970s and early 1980s were years of uncertainty. Inflation, economic instability, rising healthcare costs, and growing fear about the future weighed heavily on older Americans. Many were entering retirement with anxiety instead of security. Others were facing chronic illness, medical debt, or loneliness. Into that fear stepped Popoff. He did not present himself as a theologian. He presented himself as a messenger. At his revival meetings, Popoff appeared to possess supernatural knowledge. He would stand before massive crowds and call out individuals by name, often elderly men and women, describing their illnesses, personal struggles, and family problems with uncanny precision. For someone watching from the audience, it felt impossible to explain. How could he know? What power could do this? Popoff framed this knowledge as proof of divine authority. God, he claimed, was speaking directly to him. And if God was speaking through him, then his instructions were not suggestions. They were commands. At the center of those commands was faith. And faith, Popoff taught, was not passive belief. It was action. Specifically, financial action. Donations were described as seed faith. Money given to the ministry was not lost, it was planted. And planted seeds, Popoff promised, would grow into miracles. Healing, debt relief, financial stability, restored lives. Many of the people who gave were not wealthy. They were retirees, widows, veterans, people living on fixed incomes, people with medical bills and shrinking savings. But they gave anyway. Because Popoff offered something more powerful than logic. He offered certainty. Then, in 1986, that certainty collapsed. Investigative journalists revealed that Popoff's divine knowledge came not from God, but from a hidden radio earpiece. His wife and staff gathered personal information from prayer cards before services and transmitted it to him during performances. Audio recordings captured the deception clearly. There was no ambiguity, no theological debate, no misunderstanding. The miracles were staged. The fallout was swift and humiliating. Popoff's reputation was destroyed. His ministry imploded. Television stations cut ties. Donations disappeared. He filed for bankruptcy. To the public, the case seemed closed. A fraud exposed, a cautionary tale completed. But belief does not operate on logic alone. Years later, Peter Popoff returned, not to television stages, but to something far more intimate: the mailbox. Popoff began sending millions of letters across the United States, carefully targeting older Americans. The letters were deeply personal in tone, written as if Popoff knew the recipient personally. You are not forgotten. God showed me your name. You are chosen for a miracle. Inside these envelopes were small packets labeled Miracle Spring Water. Popoff claimed the water had been blessed and carried divine power. He insisted it was not magic, but a point of contact for faith. Recipients were encouraged to pray with the water and to demonstrate faith by sending donations. The testimonials included in the letters were dramatic. People claimed debts vanished, unexpected checks arrived, serious illnesses reversed. Financial breakthroughs occurred overnight. To critics, the strategy was obvious. The spectacle was gone. The deception was quieter. But the structure remained intact. Once again, belief was tied to giving. Consumer protection groups investigated the operation and warned the public. Journalists exposed misleading claims and unverifiable testimonials. Yet legally, Popoff remained protected. Because everything was framed as belief. No guarantees, no contracts, no promises that could be enforced. Only faith. And faith, when marketed carefully, becomes untouchable. Former followers later described the emotional grip of Popoff's letters. They arrived during moments of vulnerability, after hospital visits, after financial setbacks, after the loss of a spouse. The letters spoke directly to fear. You are next. Your miracle is already in motion. Do not miss this opportunity. Many recipients sent money they could not afford. Some sent their last savings. Some sent retirement funds. When nothing happened, the explanation was always internal. You must keep believing. Doubt blocks the blessing. God's timing is different. The system protected itself by shifting blame inward. This is the most dangerous mechanism of prosperity theology. It never allows falsification. If it works, the preacher is validated. If it fails, the believer is blamed. The doctrine is never wrong. Psychologists studying religious influence point to Popoff as an example of commitment escalation. Once people invest emotionally and financially into a belief, walking away becomes painful. Accepting deception would mean accepting loss of money, trust, and identity. For older believers, this is especially difficult. At later stages of life, people crave meaning, stability, and reassurance that their sacrifices mattered. Admitting exploitation threatens that foundation, so belief persists. Popoff understood this deeply. He did not need credibility. He needed hope. Hope that illness would ease. Hope that finances would recover. Hope that someone, anyone, was listening. From a theological standpoint, Popoff's ministry represented a complete inversion of Christian teaching. Faith became a lever. God became a mechanism. Religion became a system for extracting money through expectation. Yet Popoff was never imprisoned for his later operations. And that fact is unsettling. Because it shows that exploitation does not always require lies. It only requires belief structured to protect itself. Peter Popoff's story forces an uncomfortable realization. Truth alone is not enough to dismantle harmful belief systems. Exposure alone is not enough. Because prosperity theology does not survive on evidence. It survives on emotional need. And as long as fear, illness, loneliness, and financial insecurity exist, someone will offer certainty in exchange for trust. Popoff is not the most powerful figure in this series. He is not the richest. He is not the most respected. But he may be the most revealing. Because his story proves that faith can survive deception, that belief can outlast exposure, and that hope, when monetized, can become a weapon. For older viewers watching this documentary, Popoff's story is not about mockery or judgment. It is a warning. A warning that sincerity does not protect against manipulation, that belief deserves accountability, and that faith should never demand silence when questions arise. Because when religion becomes a product, when miracles become marketing, and when belief is measured by donations, the vulnerable always pay the highest price.